It's fine if you want.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. While I do some last-minute housekeeping here with our speakers, thank you, everybody, for coming out for this event. We think it's an important one. We do it every year at this time. Many of you have come in years past, and we're happy to have you back. And some of you maybe are here for the first time, and we're delighted to have you as well. Our panelists this morning are going to speak to us about where we think we can make some headway in the coming years with a new administration on a variety of policy fronts. And I'm very happy to be able to introduce Mehrsa Baradaran to my left, Eileen Appelbaum from the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Mehrsa is at the University of Georgia Law School, and Bill Lazonick at the University of Massachusetts, Lowell. So I think, have decided, Bill, maybe you'll kick us off.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, thanks. Great to be here. I have some slides. You're going to put those up? Actually, I just last May retired from the University of Massachusetts Lowell. Retired from teaching because I run a nonprofit called the Academic Industry Research Network, and a lot of the research I present here is being done there through funding, a lot of funding from fortunately, from the Institute for New Economic Thinking. And I've got a great team of researchers working on this. Okay. Do you have the slides up? Huh? Oh, they're there? Oh. No. Click it? Okay, great. Okay, thanks. Okay, so I'm going to focus on the role of the corporation and the need for policy related to corporate governance. And actually, there is some policy being put forward now related to corporate governance, as I'll get to at the end. If we want to talk about a just economy, we want equitable and stable economic growth. We want growth, some productivity growth. Want it to be stable, but equitable. That's actually a squishier concept, but I think if we particularly start looking inside corporations, we see that it's not equitable. And in the past, there was something we could call a distribution of income in corporations that was more equitable. Unfortunately, it was mainly white males who benefited from that. And when white males stopped being a lot of the main recipients of this, or at least other groups, blacks and women in particular, started gaining access to the jobs that white males had, a lot of that started to disappear. So the main thrust of the arguments that I make is that if we want to understand income distribution, we have to understand, first of all, investment and productive capabilities. So this is actually a supply-side argument, but it's very different than the neoclassical supply-side argument because they don't have a theory of investment and productive capabilities. And I talk about households, governments, and businesses. These are all organizations that make these investments. And ultimately, we need businesses to invest in productive capabilities, which includes the productive capabilities of people, first and foremost. Now, what we have now in corporations, and I would argue that this is the main area in which income distribution gets played out, is what I've been calling predatory value extraction. I have a book coming out with a colleague named Jang Sup Shin, who's in Korean, who's in Singapore, where we have developed some of the analysis I'll show you today very quickly. But it's basically extreme income inequality, where people who are extracting value and from within business corporations who have very little contribution to make that value. And that includes a lot of senior executives, investment bankers, Wall Street bankers, and hedge fund managers. Okay, now everybody knows these data on income distribution. This is one that appeared in the New York Times a little while ago, based on the tax return data that Piketty and Say's use, where the gray line is 1946 to 1980, and the gains of different groups on the horizontal axis is percentiles of the income distribution, and as you can see, the bottom gained over that 34-year period. Then they compared 1980 to 2014, and you can see in that red line who's making the gains. This is the EPI data. A lot of people use these data on the gap between productivity and pay. And my main argument is that this is something that's really driven by a massive change in the way income distributed within companies, what a relationship between productivity and pay. Now, these data are from the Census Bureau. There are more recent data, but they only every 5 years they show revenues. But they don't change that much from year to year. It's become a little more concentrated. But basically, if you take that, pink line, 5,000 companies averaging over 20,000 employees, that's within the United States. 5,000 employees or more, 1,900 companies. They have about 34% of the employment in the business sector. 38% of the payroll and 44% of the revenues. What they do or do not do with their money, with their profits, with their resources, affects the way the whole economy operates. The research that I came to this notion by looking at within corporations, and I started noticing in the late 80s, basically, the companies were doing all these stock buybacks. And I said, why are they doing them in addition to dividends? And I've watched it since then, and it's become worse and worse and worse. It's this year, it's estimated that just the S&P 500 companies will do $800 billion to $1 trillion in buybacks, and a lot of that is that'll be by far a record. The highest level was about $600 billion in 2007, and that was almost equaled in 2015. But this is also fueled in addition by the tax cuts. I got a lot of visibility for these arguments in a paper article I had published in Harvard Business Review about 4 years ago. The important part is the subtitle there: stock buybacks manipulate the market and leave most Americans worse off. So I helped change Harvard Business Review for a while, at least, into a radical economics journal. I was sure that they were going to get rid of that subtitle. They told me at the last minute, the last change was we have to change the subtitle, and I had how stock buybacks manipulate the market. They just took out the how. So that got a lot of visibility, and I think actually there were a lot of people within corporations who understood that they shouldn't be doing this, and that this was causing great damage to the corporation. Now, the general argument I have is that we've gone from an era when you had slightly more trend to income equality post-World War II of when companies retained and reinvested. You had career employment within companies. You had a distribution of profits went back into keeping people employed, pay increases, better benefits, et cetera. Again, this was really a white male world, to a general trend to what I call downsize and distribute. Companies will slash wages, lay off people offshore. It doesn't matter how long they've worked there, and they'll distribute the cash to shareholders in forms of dividends and increasingly buybacks. I made this argument in a Brookings paper that was a kind of derivative of the fact that the article was published in Harvard Business Review. That gave Brookings, I think, the right to publish something, or someone in Brookings wanted to do this. Most of the buybacks that are done are open market repurchases. They're nothing but a manipulation of the market. And the reason they're done is because of once obscure rule that I think I've helped to bring to light, called Rule 10b-18, that was adopted in November of 1982, and it was a direct result of Reagan getting elected and putting a Wall Street guy named John Shad at the head of the SEC, and basically the SEC saw that believed in Chicago economics, and the more money sloshing around in the economy, the more capital formation there is, which is nonsense, but I won't get into that in any detail. But here, this is the one article that appeared at the time, the only article. It was very informative, and you can see in the subtitle, agency assures it won't file charges of manipulation if certain rules are met. So it's basically on the books of the SEC that it could be manipulation, and this is something actually when it was adopted, there was no public comment on it at all. And it's never been vetted or ratified or legislated in any way by Congress. The critical thing here, there was some attempt to limit buybacks, which were more stringent, but still, in my view, would have allowed too much before Rule 10b-18. But the critical point is when they allow 25% of your average daily trading volume for the previous 4 weeks and any single day to be bought back, and it's a safe harbor, so that if you go above that amount, you won't necessarily be charged with manipulation. If you stay below that amount, you definitely won't be charged with manipulation. Now, basically, I call this basically a license to loot. Now, here, if you look at, recently I looked at the data, this means that Apple can do almost about $1.4 billion a day, day after day after day, in juicing up its stock price. This past year, Apple did $73 billion, a new record. It had set the previous record of $45 billion in 2014. And there are some of the other numbers of companies, how much they can do under this safe harbor. The fact is, this is a very good article by David Dyan, which he interviewed me for in 2015. It was a response to something I'll show you in a couple minutes, some letters from Tammy Baldwin, senator, to the SEC asking why they were doing all this stuff and allowing it. And basically, Mary Jo White, who's pictured there, the chair of the SEC at the time, said, you can't violate Rule 10b-18 because it's a safe harbor. You can just avail yourself of it. And, in fact, the SEC doesn't even know the exact dates on which companies do buybacks. They don't have the data because they don't collect the data, and they never have. Okay. Here, if we take the same companies going back to 1981, if we go back before buybacks were minimal, you can see that buybacks, the blue part, has been piled on top, basically, of dividends. The dividends have not decreased, and these are in 2017 dollars. This is a little more complicated, just the payout ratios. This is for the last 10 years, basically $4 trillion. We look at the same companies going back in time, so as the further back we go, the more companies we lose. They have to be listed over the whole period. $4 trillion in buybacks, about 53% of net income, plus about over 40% of net income in dividends. Then we look at the leading companies, and I like to say that we're only constrained by time, money, and people in doing research on this stuff, because we know how to dig into these companies and look at what they're doing and the damage that buybacks do, and that's where we really see this happening. And I'll give you very briefly just the example of the pharmaceutical industry, and this has gotten a lot of attention for people who are critical of high drug prices, access to medicine, people like Doctors Without Borders. They've seen the value of this research. We, as taxpayers, have funded life sciences research since they started recording the expenditures in 1938, over $1 trillion. The current budget is over $37 billion. And companies, this is basically a chart which is a little hard to read, but basically companies in the S&P 500, 19 pharmaceutical companies over the decade 2007-2016 spent something like $564 billion on buybacks and dividends, and it was about 16% more in their spending on R&D. They say they need high drug prices in order to accelerate R&D, but that's not how they're using the high drug prices. There's much more I could say on that. As I had a discussion with Dan Frumkin before, these are Pfizer and Merck. You can see if you look at the BB plus DV over net income going back decades, they've been spending more of the 100% of their net income on buybacks and dividends. That means they're laying off people, they're selling assets, whatever, eating into capital. Okay. I'll skip over some of this. There's a lot more that I could say about this, but I don't want to take up too much time. We have an analysis now. This is in the book with Janice Shin, which should be out in 6 or 7 months, where we look at CEOs as the value extracting insiders. They're enabling all this. They accepted shareholder value ideology. This is what they should do with their money. This goes back to the mid-1980s. We have the institutional investors who have become the enablers, and then increasingly important are the hedge fund activists. who are hugely powerful and can rip apart a company like GE going on now with less than 1% of the shares through what is a really corrupt proxy voting system that most people don't know much about and which I won't try to explain now for lack of time. We look at, these are the 500 highest paid CEOs, executives, not CEOs, each year from 2008 2017, and you can see the orange and purple part. That's stock-based pay. That's what incentivizes them to do buybacks. And by the way, these are the correct data. Almost all the data reported, even by the AFL-CIO, unfortunately, on their executive pay watch database are phony data based on Black-Scholes-Merton option pricing models are just junk. And these are the correct data. We know what they actually get paid, but they're not used. That's another story. Here's the institutional investors, and here's the hedge funds. Some of the names you'll know, but the ones underlined are the activists. Someone just sent me a note from who works on Japan that Daniel Loeb is ripping apart a company, Fanuc, one of the great Japanese companies now. Paul Singer is in Germany ripping apart ThyssenKrupp, which is one of the oldest steel companies. And actually, they don't know what to do about it in those countries. They're not prepared for this. Okay, and just here are the top 15 hedge fund managers average about 5 times the pay of the remuneration of the top 15 corporate executives in 2016. Okay, there's a critique of this, which I basically don't have time to get into in any detail, but it's basically that shareholders don't really contribute to companies, just buy and sell shares, and everybody should know that. And the fact that people will go around calling shareholders investors, they own companies, where do you get fake news from? I mean, the stock market does not play that role. It actually does not play the role of funding companies. It plays the role of allowing us as households to find some way to try to get a yield on our income if companies are doing well. It's workers and taxpayers, basically, who are funding companies, taking the risks, taxpayers through things like the NIH and all the infrastructure and knowledge that companies use. Okay, so, but in the mid-1980s, or starting really in the 1970s, people came along and said, no, that money belongs to shareholders, disgorge the cash flow, more efficient allocation of resources. It's not really about ownership. It's about efficient allocation of resources. And that's what's happening. And that really justified buybacks. This shows the hits in the Wall Street Journal on shareholder value, really from the mid-1980s. Whoops. Okay, what's going on here? Okay, I only have about a minute left, so let me just go to some stuff at the end. Okay, this, to say just a half minute on this, there's a well-known article by Milton Friedman that in 1970 New York Times about the only social responsibility of a business is to increase its profits. I always thought it was nonsense. Milton Friedman knew nothing about how corporations work. There was someone whose son is here who's knew a lot about how corporations worked at the time, but Milton Friedman wasn't paying any attention to what John Kenneth Galbraith was saying. But it's worse than that. Basically, this guy here is the chairman of GM, and he was fighting off a Nader-inspired campaign GM that wanted to put public interest representatives on boards. And that was overwhelmingly defeated at the annual meeting where he's pictured in May of 1970. And then the editor of the New York Times recruited Friedman to publish this article, and where he said that basically what was going on, I have it on another slide, that this argument about social responsibility and the reason they needed the public interest representatives was because of fuel efficiency and safety, was that was pure and unadulterated socialism. This is actually, there were 13 members of Congress who were behind this, including that's Shirley Chisholm, mostly in the New York area, who were pushing for people, public interest people on boards. Now, the important thing to take from this is that if we know what happened in the auto industry from 1970 on, it wasn't just social responsibility, it was innovation. If you wanted to be a leader in the auto industry, you had to deal with safety and fuel efficiency. These were two dimensions, and this is something the GM didn't do. So they should have put those people on the board back in 1970. And basically what Friedman was telling people, coming from his point of view, and this is the clarion call for shareholder value, according to everybody, was companies should not be innovative, and they should not try to address the needs of the people, not just the workers, but of the people they're supposed to be selling their products to. Okay, so what we have is basically a theory of value extraction, like a predatory value extraction, and I guess the subtitle of this meeting is Advice to Congress, and fortunately some members of Congress get it, and some have been reelected. And the person who's got it most has been Tammy Baldwin, and I've worked with a fellow named Brian Conlon, who has one of her staffers since 2015. I was contacted, and we've basically been discussing this, and it's ongoing, about the problem. And she sent 2 very probing letters to Mary Jo White, the SEC, saying, what the hell's going on here, and why are you allowing this? And that's where that article came out, for example, that said that the SEC doesn't even have the data to monitor it. You can't violate the Rule 10b-18. Okay. She's also used our stuff on the pharmaceutical industry to go after the pharmaceutical lobby. And the Senate Democrats have just about a year ago started embracing the buybacks research as a response to the tax cuts. Last June, 21 senators sent a letter to the SEC talking about the damage the buybacks do and asking for a period of comment. Clayton, the SEC chair, has evaded that. There's the signatures, though. All of them are back except Donnelly. Tammy Baldwin introduced the Reward Work Act, which would rescind Rule 10b-18 and have all corporations have a third of their board members be worker representatives. And Elizabeth Warren, and this is something that Bob Hockett was working on, and I was providing some comments on drafts. The Accountable Capitalism Act, which is focused mainly on about 1,900 companies with about $1 billion in revenues or more, have 40% of their board members be elected by workers, and also restrict executive pay and cashing in on stock-based pay. And the last thing I'll say is that if these were to go through, what we need would be a huge educational process for those representatives about why they should be doing things differently than done. Because if they don't have the analysis, they're going to get hammered by the people who are just saying buybacks are great and that maximize shareholder value. Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. I'm going to go next. Yeah, Mehrsa.
Can I sit here?
Yeah, sure. Where you're comfortable.
So Stephanie asked me actually to not present, but to give actual just advice to Congress. So I'm going to do that. So I'll just sit and talk very informally. So I think there's, before I get to the sort of actionable plans to Congress, I want to talk about 3 myths that I think we need to get over before we can sort of move forward. And it's great that he brought up Milton Friedman, because I think so much of the wrong thinking on policy came during that era, not just Friedman, but Greenspan and, Goldwater and Nixon. And so I've talked about it quite at length in my histories of this era, but I want to kind of boil it down to 3 different things. And one is that the myth of sort of expertise and models as the way to sort of understand money, right? That money is this sort of platonic ideal out there that our modeling and our data can sort of conceive of, as opposed to money as a result, money and credit, I should say, and wealth as a result of democratic decision making. And so this is, I do banking, that's my focus. Banking policy is government policy. Banking and governments have been umbilically sort of tied together across the world and across U.S. history. And for much of our history, I mean, you see this up until the 1970s, policy decisions in banking were very much in the realm of public discussion, right? So you have presidential debates centering on monetary policy. And we sort of make fun right now of the, William Jennings Bryan cross of gold, but the gold-silver debate was at the heart of politics at a certain time, right? What is that about but not monetary policy and credit expansion? And, I've taken track of debates recently, and banking and monetary policy never comes up. And this is because of the turn in the 1970s with the Greenspan sort of data, right? Data will fix it. I'm reading Volcker's new memoir, and he also understands that the model sort of, this is how you understand money. The more you sort of study the modeling and the data, the more you can sort of conceive of monetary policy. And I think that is a mistake. And I think it is the reason why the banking crisis turned into a political crisis, because though every policymaker, and I've read every one of these memoirs as well, every policymaker, Geithner, Bernanke, Paulson, feels like they did the work. They fixed it. They solved it. Yet everyone on the outside feels like they were hoodwinked and sort of sold a lie. And so I think this is what we need to encounter. Those of us who work in policy and in the experts need to understand that is something that is a result of the way that the technocracy sort of took over the solutions. I don't know if you all have watched The Big Short. I've seen it once. My students, I teach banking law every year. My students are obsessed with this film. In fact, I ask them, why do you take banking? And they say, because of The Big Short. And that's their understanding of the banking crisis. And I think it's unfortunate. However, it is what it is. And at the end, I just was reminded, because one of my students used it in her presentation yesterday in class, at the end of The Big Short, I don't know if you recall, but at the end of The Big Short, there's this ending where Ryan Gosling says, and then they fixed the crisis, and then they put a bunch of bankers in jail, and they, the SEC did these reforms, and and then they, and now we've not had a return to standard order. He's like, just kidding. They blamed black and brown people and immigrants, and nothing was done. And it was actually jarring to see that, because I had forgotten that was the ending. But I think that is the solution. That is the missed path that a lot of my students, at least, think, put people in jail. And I actually don't think that was the response, but that's what a lot of the public was expecting. And so I think this idea of money as a democratic sort of, or the credit policy and banking policy needs to be something that we debate in the public forum, as opposed to a realm of just federal reserve. So that's the first myth. The second myth is my focus on inequality and specifically the racial wealth gap. And so the myth here is that we, the civil rights era sort of fixed the problems of the past, and I like to refer to the civil rights laws as deregulation, because that's what they were. Even though Milton Friedman and the libertarians opposed the Civil Rights Act, what the Civil Rights Acts did was to regulate away the Jim Crow era barriers that restricted free market entry to the black population for a century, right? That was not capitalism. And so, in studying the racial wealth gap and just general economic inequality, you can trace every sort of gap back to some federal government program, the FHA redlining, or the Homestead Acts, and things like that. And so I think, the last sort of stage of the Civil Rights Act, the FHA and what was going to happen after 1968 got halted. And so we still have a lot of work to do in that remedy. So that's the second myth, is that we fixed those inequalities. And I talk about that in the book. So the third is to the solutions. And I think the myth to get over here is banking or I should say, the myth that community banking or local banking is the answer to poverty or for marginalized communities. And this also stems from that sort of libertarian / law and econ movement, although this goes back to Thomas Jefferson. So I think there's a lot of villains for this myth. But banking is federal. Banking is national. It has not maybe always been, but when we pretended that it wasn't, we had problems like, post-Jackson era, or when we were an agrarian society, maybe it worked to have sort of localism in banks. But any sort of localism in banking has been a highly regulated industry, right? So we had unit banking, we had geographic restrictions. That is the only way that local banks were able to thrive. But the model of the George Bailey Bank or the Jeffersonian sort of community bank that lifts up a poor community by pooling resources, that was all underwritten by the FHA guaranteed mortgages, by FDIC insurance, insurance, by Federal Reserve liquidity loans, by regulatory sort of infrastructure by the federal government. So I think when we're talking about solutions, over the last 30 years, for any solution for inequality, racial wealth gap, redlining, it has always been local. CRA, CDFI, and those are all well-meaning laws pushed by progressives and Democrats, but I think we need to stop that. It's not working. And the reason it's not working is because the reason why the problems exist is not because of the lack of local entrepreneurship. It has been federal oversight and federal, actually, decision-making that has left pockets of the country. So as far as solutions, one that I've proposed in previous books is reviving postal banking. So we've got a lot of banking deserts, unbanked populations. All banking is federal. Payments, credit, linking it up to the postal banks, which we've had in the country for from 1910 until 1966. Every other developed country has had it or currently operates it. So just allowing people to have small savings accounts or access to credit through the postal bank. That's one. Two, but that's a small thing. I think it's not a costly and it's a very sort of easy to remedy solution. The other are sort of bigger inequality type things, and this is where money and credit, I think, going back to the first myth, we need to take an active role. The Federal Reserve policy or congressional policy in sort of understanding the federal government's role in bringing up the bottom here in reducing inequality, specifically race-based segregation. And so I've proposed a couple things. So, something like a 21st Century Homestead Act, where you have the Federal Reserve, in the way that the Federal Reserve bought up toxic assets for AIG, buying up assets from cities like Detroit or Baltimore that are abandoned properties, and then adding some sort of development funds into those and allowing cities through a partnership to turn those over to residents and being able to sort of overcome those gaps. FHA type programs where you're talking about shared equity mortgages with borrowers in these communities and public fisc, so public banking, but retooled the way that the FHA was. And going away from this sort of zero-sum thinking in policies, right? So taking taxes from the top and giving them to the bottom. I totally support taxing sort of estates and top, but also in using the Federal Reserve monetary policy tools in inequality. I think that's vital, is the way that the credit works, the way that the FHA worked is to put a ton of money as an investment and do a long-term sort of hold on some of these things with the idea that it would come back and it would be a revolving fund. So I'm happy to talk more about those later, but that is it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Eileen?
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm very happy to be here. And I'm going to take my theme from something that Jamie said in his opening remarks. The problems have been with us for a while now. We know what they are. I'm talking now about the rise of inequality, the stagnant wages. But I think it would help us to think anew and act anew on these issues. And I'm going to propose looking at them through a slightly different lens than we've looked at them in the past. The thing about the stagnant wages and rising inequality, declining economic security, is that it's overdetermined. There are lots of causes that we can point to that can explain this. And, of course, chief among them is the decline in private sector union membership and bargaining power. So let me just say that at the outset. But I think that we can learn something by looking at the wage stagnation and rising inequality through a somewhat different lens. And I want to focus in my remarks on two things: the fissuring of the labor market and the financialization of corporations. And my remarks there will be complementary to what Bill had to say. The thing that we can see is that the fissuring and the financialization also began in the late 70s with changes in regulation, some of which Bill already referenced, and I'm not going to go into what they were, but that made these developments possible. And so they have occurred simultaneously with the rise in inequality. And I think it would behoove us to pay attention to them, number one. But number two, they also help us think about what would be the priorities. If you're going to think about a coherent set of policies to address rising inequality, rising economic insecurity, what would be the coherent set of policies you would like to start with? I have a much longer list than the ones I'm going to talk about today, but looking at it through this lens has helped me think about what are the most important things that this Congress needs to begin doing. So let me just say a few words about fishering. What do I mean by fishering? So the dominant corporations, these large, hierarchical, vertically integrated corporations. I mean, the steel mills used to own the iron ore, the trains that moved everything around, really integrated. And what has happened is over the last 40 years, what these companies want to do is they want to focus on their core competencies. They were not able to really do this before because we didn't have the kinds of technology that allowed them to monitor all of the people that they can now contract with. But with the technologies that exist today, it is now as inexpensive to monitor, maybe even cheaper, to monitor contractors than it is to actually have a hierarchy and manage your workforce internally. So the costs of these things have shifted. And what many companies are doing is they're holding on to core competencies. And what do they mean by that? They manage the brand, they do the R&D, they set the standards for production, and they set standards for consumer services, the way McDonald's does, for example, with its franchisees. That contract tells them how they're going to manage their workforce, how they're going to address their customers, and they're carefully monitored on all of this. So these are the core competencies that the firms maintain. And then they contract out for everything else. And so you have these networks to get to the final product or the final service. You have a network of firms, not necessarily a formal network. I usually refer to it as an ecosystem because they don't think of themselves as a network, but they're all contracting with some dominant company that can set the terms of these contracts. And so you have both concentration over the last 40 years in industries among these dominant firms, and then you have this fishering. You have tons of small companies that are out there competing for these contracts that frequently go to the lowest bidder. So you have all of this fragmentation going on. If the contract goes to the lowest bidder, then the contract companies are operating on very narrow margins. And even if they want to pay their workers more, they can't pay their workers more because then they don't get the contract and nobody has a job. And so, in many cases, you have workers working side by side at a workplace who are on the payroll of different companies. And the example I like to give is, because it's not one you often think about, you go to the hospital, the security guard in the lobby, the person who took your insurance information, admissions, the person who brings you your food, the person who cleans your room, and the anesthesiologist who is assisting your surgeon are all employed by, and the person who handles your billing questions afterwards, are all employed by different companies. They work side by side in this hospital, and none of them are on the payroll of the hospital. That's how you end up with balance billing, but that's another story. That bill from the anesthesiologist when the hospital was in your system. But, okay. Anyway, the thing is that it's a low bid that got them that contract, and so their wages are going to be squeezed. And not everybody who is working for a contract company is physically at the workplace. So if you think about the commercial laundry that's doing the linens, those commercial laundries are also competing for these contracts and end up operating on margins and unable to pay workers. So that's the fishering. And that, I think, people do not, we don't appreciate it because we don't have data on it. These folks all show up as workers in standard employment relationships. Yes, I go to work at the laundry. Yes, I'm employed by a security company. Yes, I'm employed by a hospitalist company owned by private equity. Another story. But anyway, they're all regular employees. They do not show up in our data, and we do not have a good way to really track the growth of it. If you ask me afterwards, I can tell you we can see the traces of it, but I don't want to take time for that now. I want to move over to financialization, and my remarks here will be complementary to Bill's. I mean, one of the other things that was going on, of course, is that the managerial capitalist enterprise, which is what you were describing as the older way of doing things, where you had people who are interested in the sustainability of the company and in producing goods and services that people might want. This reached its apogee in the late 1970s with the diversified conglomerate. And the diversified conglomerate was also its death knell, in a way, because you can't really manage it. These managers who are used to managing related lines of business did not have the industry knowledge or the skills to manage these diversified conglomerates. So profitability was, way down. And in addition, the only metrics that you can use across these diversified conglomerates are financial metrics. So with the use of financial metrics and profits going down, the finance people, the CFO, became the most important person in the corporation. They have a whole different view of things, and you see them now, diversifying, getting rid of lines of business, selling out of things, and so on. Over the 1980s, the balance of power shifted from a stakeholder view of the model of the corporation to one in which nothing mattered except for maximizing returns for shareholders. And as I said before, a lot of these things have many sources behind them. But one of them is the fact that the managerial model had just gone haywire and finance people took over, and that balance of power shifted. And again, once you're now focused on your returns, you find yourself, again, focusing on core competencies, selling off or shutting down lines of business that you don't view as core, and outsourcing major functions, payroll, benefits, purchasing, what you might think of as major functions of a corporation are now being outsourced. And again, companies are told the business strategy is focus on your core competencies, get rid of everything else. And in this context, labor becomes an input like any other. It's no longer an asset, it's a cost to be managed. And I have been on panels where corporate people have said outright, the last thing I want to do is hire a worker, put those workers on somebody else's payroll. Workers think that they should have paid family leave, they should have paid sick days, they want an increase in pay. They're a pain in the neck. Get them off my payroll. And so they've actually said it. If we look at if we want to look at shareholder value on steroids, it would be the private equity model. And Bill was talking about a license to loot. There is no greater license to loot than the private equity business model. So famously, they have no commitment to sustainability. They want to be in and out in 3 to 5 years. The heart of this model is the leverage buyout, where they take money from pension funds, foundations, wealthy investors, pool them in a private equity fund, use the private equity firm, just so you will know, puts in $1 to $2 for every $100 the pension funds put in. And so they have very little skin in the game. By the time you end up buying a business with 70% debt, they have 0.6% of the purchase price at risk. I mean, they have no risk, and they easily recoup it long before the 3 years are up. Not to worry about them. They're making their money. And so what they do is they buy, the private equity fund is the down payment on the business that they're buying. They load it up with 70% debt. They put usually about 30% down, 70% in debt. And the debt is on the company that they bought. People always ask me, is that legal? In the UK, they actually had to pass a law to make it legal. In the US, it was already legal. Nobody noticed it till 1979 with the buyout of Houdet. But anyway, once they noticed it, no problem for these finance guys to figure out how they were going to do it. So the debt multiplies the returns to the private equity firm, but it also puts the company they bought at risk. And the first thing this company has to do is it has to increase its cash flow in order to make the interest payments on the debt. And how can you quickly increase cash flow? You sell off businesses even if they're profitable. You lay off workers. You look for concession bargaining if there's a union there. You cut benefits. All of these things are the fastest way to raise that cash flow to make the interest payments. And you say to the workers, if we don't make these payments, nobody has a job. It's your choice. So no choice at all, of course. And then they pile more debt on the company in order to pay themselves dividends. That's how the private equity firm gets back its 0.6% of the purchase price. That happens really quickly. And they have many other ways. You've probably, if you read anything about Toys R Us, you saw all the ways that the private equity firms enriched themselves. The company went under. The workers got nothing. We're still fighting for severance for them. But the private equity guys, they all made money on this deal. They don't like to drive companies into bankruptcy. That's not their goal. But I always say that when they sell those companies, that's the second bite of the apple. The private equity firm already made its money back. And now they're getting the second bite, and they make a lot of money that way too. So thinking about these things, what then become the priorities for dealing with the stagnation and rising inequality? They're not a mystery. I don't like have some policies you never heard of. But I think the first thing is we have to establish minimum employment standards. And day one is that $15 an hour federal minimum wage. I think that's really important. Increasing eligibility for overtime. Guaranteeing severance payments. One of the things about this country is that it costs a company nothing to lay off its workers. So why wouldn't you just lay them off? That's cost-free. If you had severance that was related to years of service, you would have to make other decisions. And Toys is a really good example. Okay, it was the private equity companies that loaded them with debt. It was the creditors who thought they would get more out of just liquidating. And there was no calculation there. If you had to pay severance to 33,000 workers, many of whom were there for 25 and 30 years, your calculation as a creditor would have been very different. You would never have thought to liquidate. You would have said, what can we do to make this work? How do we restructure? Or we're not going to get anything out of this. So severance, which has not gotten much attention in this country, is one of my key things we should be working on. The second thing is sharing prosperity through expanding the social wage. Again, no mysteries here, but what we have, you have all of these people who work in these little companies that are depending on contracts. Even if we had a strong union movement, it would be really difficult to organize them. They employ 20, 30 people. The resources it takes to unionize them would be enormous. And unions in the olden days and even today, we have not gotten paid family leave in any state without the support of a labor movement in that state. The labor movement might be little, but it's a big organization relative to many others and a really good partner on these things. So labor has always worked on the social wage, and we need to do more of that. And so on day two, the thing we have to do is preserve the Affordable Care Act, increase people's access to health care, expand coverage, especially all of the attacks on women's health. These things have to be rolled back. We need to expand the funding of community health centers. They are in the ACA. They were being funded. That funding is being cut back. We have to expand it. This is where people can get their primary care, have their chronic conditions like diabetes, blood pressure, other asthma, other chronic conditions managed, and where we can address the opioid crisis and put these things in rural areas that so desperately need them. These safety net hospitals, the hospitals with 25 beds in rural areas, have been closing down at an amazing rate. So we need to deal with that. We need to expand Medicare to, this is one of Jamie's proposals, to people from age 55 as a first step on the road to Medicare for all. A lot of these things will pass in the House. We'll put Republicans on notice, because if they can't vote for these things and the president can't sign them, it will be really clear that they are not the people that you want if you're a working person. And I think we set the table for Medicare for all in 2021, but also for many of the other things that we want. The third is to renew the national commitment to full employment and good jobs. This would be the infrastructure bill. We desperately need it. We need the infrastructure, and we need the good jobs. And we need to make sure that they pay prevailing wage. We need to urge the Fed to strengthen the guidelines that limit the amount of debt on a company. We did have guidelines. They're not being enforced, and they need to be not just for banks, but for non-bank entities as well. And, of course, we want the Fed to adopt policies aimed at full employment, and we want to set the table for a federal jobs guarantee in 2021. We need to develop a definition of joint employer that will apply not only to franchise companies, but to many situations where you have a dominant firm that is setting the terms of employment in a contract company. And also, private equity firms ought to be joint employers for purposes of many of our laws. The joint employer one, I think, is really important. We need to reform our bankruptcy laws and move workers from the end of the line to the front of the line. The secure creditors get paid first. The vendors and the suppliers get paid second. If there's anything left over, workers may get their unpaid vacation time, wages they were owed, Warren Act payments. It hardly ever happens. So we need to do something about that. We need to strengthen workers' bargaining power through things like card check legislation, and also, as Bill also said, something that gets workers on the boards of these corporations. The federal chartering thing act that Elizabeth Warren proposed, something where you federally charter them, they have a responsibility, and you put workers on their board. And the last thing I will say is oversight hearings. Oversight. And it's not just about the president and his money laundering and his son or anything like that. But people care about his corruption. And there's a hell of a lot of it going on. So we need oversight on corruption. Sears would be my very first. It's not private equity, it's a hedge fund. So Sears is publicly traded. And that REIT that they set up to put all the good real estate in is also publicly traded. And both of these companies have the same chair, Eddie Lampert, and he runs the same hedge fund that is the major investor, shareholder in each of these other companies. Where the heck is the SEC? These are publicly traded companies. How can this go on? It's not even private equity. So Sears would be front and center, in my opinion. Everybody will understand the corruption that happened there. Sell off the best real estate to a REIT that then sells it to build all these developments and make tons of money. Also for Warren Buffett, by the way, who is big investor in that REIT. So it wouldn't hurt to tarnish his reputation a little bit. And then wage theft. Wage theft is something else that everybody understands. Let us have a hearing on wage theft and why we're not doing enough about it. Bring in the regulators for these industries and ask them, what are you doing? And if you're not doing it, why not? We have companies that have been corrupt. We have workers and communities that were hurt. We have regulators that are not doing their job. Let's hear from all of them, and let's put pressure on those regulators. So that's my agenda for at least part of the new Congress.
Look, we do not have much time. We want to welcome former Congressman Brad Miller. I wanted to see, though, if there is a burning question, and I mean a question, Marshall.
Use the mic, please, for posterity.
Professor Lazonick, you sort of buzzed through part of your presentation that seemed to be talking about sort of separating shareholding from management of corporations, and I think this is a subject that's desperately needs to be discussed by a group like this. So I was wondering if you could kind of shed light on what you think that sort of proposal needs to be and why we would want to do that.
Very, very quick.
Basically, it's just historically the function of the stock market was to do precisely that. In fact, it's a myth that even going back 100 years that the rise of a large corporation was because you needed to raise capital. It was actually because you needed to have professional managers there to do the things that could build companies. What Eileen said broke down with conglomerate movement, which is precisely correct. So, and shareholders were always just a way of separating ownership from control, because CEOs of companies are, after all, employees. And it's just a myth of the notion that shareholders invest in companies and that they should have some responsibility. They're really the least important people in companies.
Thank you. All right, everyone. Quick break, and we'll come back at 10:05. Thank you.